Have you ever stopped to think about how insignificant you really are to the world? Yeah, that question hits like a slap in the face. But it's not meant to destroy you. It's actually the key to something no one ever told you about: freedom. From the moment you're born, you're taught to believe that you're the center of everything. Your grades, the compliments you get, the attention you chase. It all seems to confirm that you matter. But one day, reality slices right through you like a cold blade. No one cares. Not really. Not in the way you imagined. You walk down a crowded street, every face locked in their own worries. Nobody's looking at your hair, your clothes, or your recent failure. They're way too busy drowning in their own problems, their own insecurities, their own bills, their own guilt. Jung once said that part of our suffering comes from the illusion that we're special. When you finally realize you're just another face in the crowd, it feels like you shrink, almost like you fade away. But then, something shifts. This cruel kind of lightness starts to settle in. The world doesn't revolve around you, and that means you can stop performing for it. You can stop explaining yourself, stop begging for approval with every step you take. You can try, fail, disappear for a while, start over. Because no one's out here watching you under a magnifying glass. Most people are just trying to survive their own chaos. Marketing loves to sell you the idea that you're unique, but that's just so you'll buy more, to keep feeding that fantasy. Because if you ever accept how irrelevant you really are, you become dangerous. Immune to the blackmail of image, of social media, of the masks we wear. Being irrelevant isn't the end. It's the beginning of a life where you don't have to please anyone. You don't have to impress anyone. You don't have to prove anything. You just live, with more truth, more courage, and a lot more silence. And in that silence, something brutal starts to rise. The power of someone who owes nothing to anyone. The power of someone who's realized there is no audience. Only then can you finally walk, on your own feet, without waiting for applause. That's the shock. That's the liberation. From our earliest years, we're trained to perform. No one teaches us how to be, only how to appear. In school, we learn how to meet expectations. At home, how to hide our anger. At work, how to put on the face of efficiency, even when we're falling apart. Life becomes a stage, and most people have no idea they're acting. The ego is the silent director of this theater. It writes the lines, choreographs the gestures, picks out the costumes. It craves applause, approval, attention. And so, it distorts. It inflates our strengths, hides our failures, recalculates every move to fit the perfect scene. But living like this comes at a steep price, one that's invisible but corrosive, the slow erosion of authenticity. Nietzsche once wrote that modern man has become such a perfect actor. He no longer knows the difference between the mask and his own face. He no longer knows who he is without the script. And this loss of identity doesn't show up as sharp, obvious pain, but as a vague emptiness, a quiet disconnection, a homesickness for oneself that has no name. Most existential suffering doesn't come from a lack of success. It comes from the excess of performance. The more you act, the further you drift from yourself. The weaker your inner foundation becomes, because the soul knows when you're faking it, and it protests with silence, with anxiety, with sleepless nights. But there's a breaking point, a moment when the audience disappears, when you realize no one's really watching. The eyes you imagined were never really there. The judgment you feared is irrelevant. And when that truth hits, the whole theater starts to collapse. The stage gives out, and with it, the need to keep the performance alive. What's left? Shame, silence, and then freedom. You realize you don't have to act anymore. The script can be tossed aside. The character can die. And it's exactly from that collapse that the possibility of a life without chains is born. Stopping the performance isn't weakness, it's courage. It's the beginning of a life that doesn't ask for permission to exist. We live surrounded by eyes that, in truth, don't even exist. We build an imaginary audience, one that judges us, compares us, watches us, but that audience isn't really there. The feeling of being constantly observed isn't a fact of reality. It's just a distorted reflection of the ego. We assign meaning to every little move we make, as if the whole world revolved around our insecurities. But the reality is exactly the opposite. The world barely notices we exist. Believing that we are the center of other people's thoughts is a sophisticated illusion. We project onto others a constant surveillance that, most of the time, simply doesn't exist. People are way too consumed by their own problems. They're drowning in bills, failures, fears. The time you spend replaying that awkward comment or that misunderstood look is time nobody else is spending thinking about you. When Sartre said, "Hell is other people," he wasn't condemning people themselves, but our dependence on what we imagine to be their gaze. We shape our behavior around this assumed observation, and in doing so, we sacrifice essential parts of ourselves. We lose spontaneity, we lose authenticity, we lose the courage to be misunderstood. Every decision turns into an image calculation. Every gesture becomes an attempt to be accepted, and little by little, your identity dissolves into pure performance. But that outside gaze isn't even reliable. It's unstable, fragmented, fleeting. Trying to define yourself through it is like trying to capture the reflection of a cloud on water. The moment of freedom comes when that illusion finally collapses. When you realize the eyes you feared were nothing but echoes of your own anxiety. There's no court, no audience, just the neutral emptiness of a shared existence, where everyone is, above all, a stranger. And it's in that realization that a quiet kind of freedom is born. You stop living to fit inside someone else's gaze, and you start living to hold yourself in your own. A gaze that's internal, solid, incorruptible. And that, finally, is the only gaze that ever deserved your respect. The human mind is a projection machine. You walk into a room, say something awkward, and the moment you leave, you're convinced that everyone is still talking about it, judging, laughing, replaying it in their heads. You imagine it's been permanently recorded, that your mistake is now etched into the collective memory. But the brutal and freeing truth is, nobody cares. No one is thinking about you the way you think they are. Every person is locked inside their own consciousness, thinking about themselves, their own pain, their desires, their failures. Even the one who judged you for a split second. They've already been swept away by their next worry. You are nothing more than a passing fragment in the blurry edges of someone else's attention, a brief noise, an irrelevant detail. Schopenhauer once said, "Each of us is confined to our own intellect and sensations, and others are merely shadows." That limit is real. Expecting others to truly understand you or to care as deeply as you feel inside is to deny the solitary nature of human consciousness. And yet, we go on living as if we're the star of every stage, as if the world is tuned into the frequency of our anxiety. We replay conversations, reconstruct moments, rehearse alternate versions of things nobody else even noticed. We act like every little mistake was recorded. But the truth is, the world doesn't record. The world forgets. That realization, as cold as it feels, is the beginning of a new way of existing. You start to realize you have more freedom than you ever imagined. You don't need to monitor every gesture, every word. You can mess up, laugh, stumble, and no one's holding on to it like you fear. Collective memory is short. Other people's judgment is shallow. Freeing yourself from this paranoia is how you rediscover spontaneity. It's walking without the weight of invisible eyes. It's daring. Not because you'll be admired, but because failure is no longer a life sentence. It's just another step among many. The fact that people aren't constantly thinking about you isn't rejection. It's just reality. And that reality gives you something precious. Space. Space to be, to try, to rebuild. In the end, not being remembered is a gift. It means you get to live, with no trail, no caption, no cage. Being forgotten is one of the greatest fears of modern man. We live chasing permanence, likes, tributes, proof of existence, as if immortality could somehow be achieved through the memory of others. But the truth is, almost everything we are will be erased. And when that truth is fully understood, it doesn't destroy you. It cleans you. It frees you. The ego craves eternity. It's offended by anonymity. It needs to be recognized, quoted, remembered. But history is ruthless. It forgets. It swallows even the greatest. How many kings have been reduced to footnotes? How many heroes dissolved into silence? If it happens to them, what can we possibly expect for ourselves? The fear of being forgotten drives obsessive behavior. We live to leave a mark, to prove that we existed, to build an identity that can withstand time. But this desperate attempt at permanence only leads to an artificial life. We try to carve ourselves into stone when we were meant to be dancing in the sand. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his Meditations, "Soon you will have forgotten everything. Soon everyone will have forgotten you, not as a lament, but as an invitation to serenity." The inevitability of being forgotten is the backdrop for true freedom. If everything will be erased, then there's no reason to live under the weight of other people's expectations. No obligation to be relevant. When you accept forgetting as your natural fate, something shifts. You start acting with a different intention, not to be celebrated, but to be real. Your choices stop being image strategies and start becoming expressions of your essence. You stop accumulating and start emptying yourself of everything that was never truly yours. Being forgotten is harsh. It's lonely. But it's also pure. It means you can stop fighting for attention. It means you can fail without carrying the weight of eternal shame. It means you can disappear for a while, and the world won't fall apart. The freedom of being forgotten is brutal, because it dismantles the entire system of validation you've been taught to chase. But in that collapse is where the possibility of a lighter existence is born. No trail, no performance, no need for applause. You won't be remembered. And because of that, you can finally be real. Validation is a silent drug. Its effect is instant, relief, pleasure, belonging. But like any drug, It demands bigger and bigger doses. You get a compliment, and you want another. You post something, and you need approval. You make a decision, and wait for someone to congratulate you. Little by little, the center of your life shifts. It's no longer about what you believe. It's about how others react. Validation starts as recognition and ends as slavery. At first, it feels like encouragement, but over time, it becomes a need. And once it becomes a need, freedom is gone. Because now, you're no longer choosing based on conviction. You're choosing based on acceptance. Epictetus warned that the key to freedom is learning to separate what's within your control from what isn't. Other people's opinions, not within your control, which means validation is unstable territory. Looking for refuge there is like building a house on sand. The problem isn't just in the desire to be accepted, it's in what that desire demands you give up. Every time you prioritize external approval, you abandon a piece of yourself, a conviction, a desire, an authentic impulse, and those little acts of self-abandonment pile up. They become a burden, dead weight you carry around, all because you're afraid to disappoint. Validation also flips your values upside down. What's effective but unpopular gets avoided. What's shallow but praised gets repeated. Depth gives way to appearance. Truth bows to convenience. And just like that, you build a life that looks admirable on the outside, but is rotting on the inside. Breaking free from this trap takes a rare kind of courage. The courage to be misunderstood. The courage to be criticized. The courage to be ignored. Because it's in that vacuum, when there are no claps, no likes, no pats on the back, that you finally figure out who you really are and what actually matters. The absence of validation isn't a sign of failure. It's a test of conviction. If you keep going without applause, you're exactly where you're supposed to be. If you stand firm without an audience, then it's real. Letting go of the need for validation isn't apathy. It's maturity. And more than anything, it's strength. The mask isn't just a social disguise. It's a second skin, built slowly out of fear and convenience. Since childhood, you've learned what parts of yourself are safe to show, and what parts you need to hide. What earns you affection, and what triggers rejection. Over time, that adaptation turns into identity. You start confusing the character with who you really are. But eventually, the mask starts to feel heavy. Not because others suspect it, but because your own soul can't bear it anymore. There's a deep, aching fatigue that comes from keeping up appearances, from smiling when you want to scream, from playing roles that no longer make any sense. And this exhaustion isn't physical, it's existential. Kierkegaard once said that the deepest form of despair is choosing to be someone you're not, just to please others. And this choice, as common as it is silent, leads to a kind of inner paralysis. Outwardly, you keep functioning, working, talking, smiling. But inside, there's an emptiness that keeps growing. A growing absence of yourself. The fall of the mask. Usually isn't a heroic choice. It happens in collapse, in crisis, when the pain of pretending finally outweighs the fear of being real. And it's in that moment that truth starts to surface. Not as a grand revelation, but as a breakdown. You simply can't hold up what was never real in the first place. It's terrifying. Without the mask, there are no guarantees, no control over how others will see you. You open yourself to criticism, to judgment, to abandonment, but also to something you've never had before, the chance to live with integrity, to finally feel that every step you take aligns with what's beating inside of you. That's where real life begins. Not the life of expectations, narratives, and filters, but the kind of life that breathes with autonomy, that doesn't beg for approval, that's willing to be misunderstood as long as it's honest. A life that carries scars, not disguises. When the mask falls, you become vulnerable. But inside that vulnerability is something the performance could never offer you: dignity. And with it, a quiet kind of strength that no longer needs the world's permission to exist. Most people fear anonymity like it's failure, as if not being known automatically means being irrelevant. We live in a culture that worships visibility. The more seen you are, the more valued. The more talked about, the more desired. Exposure has become currency, and anonymity a punishment. But that's an illusion, a trap built to keep the ego hungry and the spirit domesticated. Anonymity, in truth, is a rare form of power, because when you're invisible, you move without chains. No one expects you to act a certain way. No one projects their expectations onto you. You're off the radar. And that means you can be whoever you want. No witnesses, no pressure, no molds to fit. Authentic freedom begins the moment the need to be seen disappears. When your actions stop being performances. When your thoughts no longer need to please anyone. When your life isn't curated for anyone's feed. You owe no explanations. You don't have to justify your choices. You simply exist, and that's enough. Nietzsche once said, "Maturity is to have rediscovered the seriousness one had as a child at play." Anonymity allows that return. You get to experiment, to fail, to start over. No one is watching to judge. No one is recording your stumbles. There is no audience. And because of that, there is space. To be anonymous is to let go of the vanity of being remembered. It's understanding that greatness isn't found in the eyes of others, but in the quiet coherence of your own steps. It's realizing that the truest life is often the least applauded. That the most noble acts aren't done in front of cameras, but in the dark, in the intimate, in the unseen. The freedom of anonymity isn't for everyone. It takes strength to give up the hit of social validation. It takes courage to disappear. But anyone who dares to walk through that emptiness discovers something the visible world could never offer: peace. And in that peace, a new kind of power is born. To be anonymous is to belong to yourself. Full freedom demands solitude. But solitude, in turn, is a place most people fear. We want to be free, but we don't want to be alone. We crave total autonomy, but we also ache for constant belonging. And it's within this conflict that the paradox reveals itself. The freer you become, the less understood you'll be. And the more authentic your path is, the more likely it is to be a solitary one. Most people live in herds, not out of malice, but out of instinct. It's easier to follow the rules, repeat the codes, blend in. Social acceptance offers comfort, and that comfort breeds dependence. Breaking away from it feels like a kind of exile. The moment you stop doing what's expected of you, you start to make people uncomfortable. The moment you refuse the collective mask, you become strange. Freedom almost always means being out of place. Camus said that freedom is not a gift, it's a conquest, and every conquest demands a loss. The loss here is that of comfortable company, the loss of connections built on convenience, the loss of approval from those who only know how to love a tamed version of you. Choosing freedom means inevitably cutting fragile ties. But that solitude isn't the absence of love. It's the absence of noise. You begin to tell the difference between what's essential and what's just distraction. You realize you don't need a crowd. You need truth. You need an inner space where your own conscience doesn't have to hide, where your decisions aren't constantly negotiated with fear. Solitary freedom isn't bitter. It's sober. It's an inhabited silence, a territory where finally you become fully responsible for yourself. No shields, no excuses. And in that responsibility, a quiet kind of power begins to emerge. The power to walk on your own, even when there's no applause, no company, and no recognition. The paradox dissolves when you accept that being alone doesn't mean being empty. Quite the opposite. It's in the absence of external interference that a person starts to finally hear what's always been muffled, their own voice. And if that voice is firm, clear, and coherent, that's enough. The freedom that comes with solitude isn't decorative. It's vital. It's in that austere, echoless space that the self is finally revealed. You've spent your whole life trying to please, trying to be noticed, trying to fit inside the gaze of others. But no one's looking. No one cares the way you thought they did. And what once felt like the peak of abandonment is actually the birthplace of freedom. The truth is simple and brutal. Most people are way too consumed by their own pain to carry yours. Your mistakes won't be remembered. Your virtues, for the most part, will go unnoticed. Your existence will almost always be invisible. But it's inside this emptiness of expectations that the chance to build something real finally appears. You don't have to impress anyone anymore. You don't have to perform. You don't have to chase approval from distracted eyes. You are, finally, free to be without performing, to be without applause, to be in silence, in truth, in full intensity. When you finally grasp that there is no audience, every action gains meaning for its own sake. You stop acting for reward and start acting out of coherence. You realize that dignity isn't found in exposure, it's found in integrity. And strength doesn't come from applause. It comes from the courage to stand firm in who you are, even when no one's watching. 3 truths to carry with you now. You are irrelevant to others, and that means you are free to live without justifying yourself. External validation is an addiction, and quitting it is how you reclaim power over your identity. The solitude of freedom is real, but it's in that solitude where your true voice starts to speak. So ask yourself, do you want to be seen, or do you want to be real? It's time to abandon the illusion. It's time to walk without an audience. Now, tell me, do you have the courage to live as if no one's watching?